When I first was diagnosed with HIV, it was it was a huge shock. I wasn't educated on what HIV was really, and my mindset was definitely back in the 80s. I thought I was going to die. I thought it was a death sentence, and I thought my parents would have to witness me dying. So that was the initial response, and it was difficult. I was in my third year of university and just had to sort of get on with it, and I kind of did get on with it. I think as a gay man, I was already experiencing quite a lot of shame anyway, and this was kind of like almost like the icing on the cake in a way. I was probably keeping my HIV status to myself because essentially deep down I was probably still a bit ashamed of being HIV positive. Even though I've come a long way on my journey, it's been 10 years since I was diagnosed, and probably started to accept it a little bit more from a personal level. I still wasn't really ready for people to know, other than people who needed to know. And I think that's all attached to the stigma and shame that still exists around HIV. I didn't feel like it was something that everybody needed to know about because I wasn't comfortable with how people would react. But yeah, it wasn't until I watched. There was actually a moment when I watched. It was when I watched It's a Sin on Channel 4, and there was an amazing speech at the end about shame, and I realised I was holding that, keeping that shame, and how it's linked to homophobia. And I didn't want to conform with that anymore, and so that kind of made me feel like I wanted to talk about it, and I did that in a public forum for my process, but also maybe to try and help other people, and try and kind of be part of that movement of change. I think in terms of stigma, like obviously I wasn't comfortable enough to talk about my status, so in a way that was kind of. That's quite difficult living with a secret for 10 years. You know, I was in the closet till I was probably 21 because I didn't feel comfortable with telling people that I was gay. And then within the same year I was diagnosed with HIV, so I was like back in the closet. And I think just the trauma of keeping something a secret because you feel like you can't talk about it in a public way is somehow it's challenging because you're not being true. You're not being able to speak your truth. When I started to sin, it was like holding a mirror up to the 21-year-old me, and like all of these fears that I thought that was going to happen was just boom. I saw me on my deathbed. I saw my mum giving me a hug, and all of that was like really traumatic. And if I'd been educated on what HIV was and how truly it was preventative, like that PEP existed at the time of my diagnosis, I could have prevented all of that trauma. And that was a trauma that I literally hid under the carpet and just thought, no, I need to get on with it. Since I spoke openly about my HIV status, the response kind of blew my mind, to be honest, because I did it for my process initially, and also if I could help other people, then great. But the video was watched like 60,000 times. BBC got hold of it, and I mean I spoke to David Furnish on live on BBC News. So it just kind of confirmed to me that, actually reaffirmed that what I had to say was actually even more important than what I had originally thought. The reaction was crazy, not just from people who were positive, but people who were negative contacted me and just said, oh wow, I was so educated and touched by what you had to say. Which just makes me realize that, actually I'm an expert because I've known this for like 10 years, but so many people who aren't affected by it are really still quite ignorant to what it is to have HIV in 2021. So yeah, I think it's really important to keep talking about it, and I'm really happy to now have a voice and be part of that. I think if I could speak to somebody who had just been diagnosed, and in actual fact, someone did contact me literally the day after I talked about it on Instagram, and said that I was diagnosed today. I had a conversation with that person, and I just said that he's going to be fine, and that he can take one pill a day. From a medical perspective, HIV is not going to be a problem for him, and it's just he needs to work on the mental health side of his illness, because that's more where the problem lies today. And I think, like, he doesn't need to go through the years of trauma that I went through, and hopefully, with things like It's a Sin being in the media and people talking about it and educating, and the public opinion changing about HIV, he won't have to go through that, and he can just look after his condition with one pill a day, just like any other chronic illness can be looked after. It's like I used this the analogy the other day to someone. It's like carrying a rucksack on your back. Like, it's not an issue. You don't feel it when you're walking with a rucksack because you just forget it's there. But it is weighing you down in some way. And I think until you actually fully acknowledge it, and for me it was, I know it's not as simple for everyone, but it was the process of being able to talk freely about it and put myself out there in a vulnerable space, but like just be me. That wasn't until I was able to like take that rucksack off. And since I've done that, it's just been like crazy, just elevated. Like, I can talk about HIV, like it's just amazing to be able to talk about it now. And even just like looking at the word, it's colourful now. Whereas before it was like dark and black and horrible connotations when I used to think about HIV. And until very recently, and it wasn't until I was able to free myself, take that rucksack off, and now that I see the word in a different light,